And I might as well tell you, I like beer, and I like birds, and I like gardens. And if you put them all together, I say you've got a natural. You've got Busch Gardens in Van Nuys.
Roll out the barrel, we'll have a barrel of fun. There's a garden, what a garden, only happy faces bloom there. Every time they hear that ooh-pa-pa, everybody feels so tra-la-la.
The Southern Pacific Railroad began servicing California's San Fernando Valley in the 1870s, loading dry wheat grain into jimmies from Isaac Van Nuys fields for clients as far away as Europe. Some orders were likely destined for the breweries of Bavaria. In 1954, the same rail company found itself moving barley in the opposite direction, unloading near the corner of Roscoe and Woodley to fuel the expansion of one of America's most prominent names in beer. The Los Angeles Brewery, a $20 million facility in the neighborhood of Van Nuys, was only the second brewery built by Anheuser-Busch outside of St. Louis, Missouri. Spearheaded by company president Gussie Busch, the plant was a stepping stone towards the executive's goal of making Anheuser-Busch the largest brewer in the world, a title claimed just 3 years later. August Anheuser-Busch Jr. was born in 1899. His paternal grandfather, Adolphus Busch, was the German-born beer magnate who had transformed the core brand of his father-in-law's St. Louis brewery business into the most successful, nationally distributed beer of the pre-Prohibition era.
There's fun at a concert or a show in your own backyard, wherever you go. Budweiser beer is for folks who know where there's life. There's Budweiser.
Gussie started his career on the brewery floor and rose through the ranks by sweat and salesmanship. August Jr. idolized his grandfather and inherited his marketing savvy. Gussie was the executive behind Budweiser's world-famous Clydesdale team. In 1933, he had the Clydesdales deliver the first post-Prohibition suds to FDR's White House, subsequently coronating the Scottish draft horses as the Budweiser mascot. When his father, August Sr. died in 1946, the reins of the company went into Gussie's ambitious hands. 5 years into his tenure as CEO, Gussie opened the company's second brewery in Newark, New Jersey. It was Anheuser-Busch's first new plant in 99 years. The Los Angeles Brewery came online 3 years later. A fourth brewery got the green light, this time for the Central Florida town of Tampa. Ever the showman, Gussie wanted this facility to offer an experience worthy of Budweiser's impressive legacy. And to achieve that, he would follow in the family tradition. That Busch family tradition went back to 1904, and the beautification project Adolphus Busch initiated behind his winter home in the Chaparral of Pasadena, California. Ultimately covering 36 acres, the peacockish German immigrant deployed a regiment of gardeners and labourers to create a pleasure park of blooms, water features, and other visual delights. Known as both Busch Gardens and Busch Sunken Gardens, the attraction was formally opened to the public in 1909, free of charge. It had informally been welcoming the curious since work began in 1906. Terrace slopes enclosed inside a stonework seawall were cross-hatched by crowded walkways. Thousands of visitors arrived by the California streetcar line to spend the day admiring exotic flowers, weeping willows, and other alluring fauna, as well as statues, fairy tale dioramas, and a recreation of the Banbury Cross Mill. Adolphus Busch Gardens promoted the Budweiser brand in much the same way as the company's handful of restaurants and saloons did back in St. Louis. Truth be told, the sunken gardens were also a highly visible demonstration of the Busch family's New World success to the Gilded Age neighbours along Millionaires Row. For 24 years after Adolphus's death, his widow, Lily, kept the sunken gardens going. With the help of Hollywood, they survived both Prohibition and the Great Depression.
It's like heaven being with you again.
Heaven wasn't so far away all the time, you know.
Lily offered the attraction to the city of Pasadena, however the gift was declined, several times in fact. The original Busch Gardens closed in 1937. In 1959, Adolphus's grandson looked out over the former airfield next to the Tampa Brewery and saw an opportunity to one-up nearby rival Schlitz.
Let's get together with a glass of Schlitz, the one great beer in Schlitz.
The beer that made Milwaukee famous simply because it tastes so good.
Gussie's vision started with a traditional beer garden, then got more colourful by making it a tropical oasis. It went over the top with the addition of an interactive bird sanctuary. Soon as it was open, tourists flocked to the Tampa Brewery to pet the roaming avians, ascend the stairway to the stars, and of course, drink free beer. This was the new Busch Gardens, and it became Gussie's favourite stomping grounds. Busch Gardens in Tampa joined Lowry Park Zoo as one of the top 2 attractions of Hillsborough County and quickly gained the company barrels of brand equity. 4 years later, the Crown looked to the Southland for the encore. Busch's Van Nuys Brewery settled easily into the surrounding community. The post-war housing boom quintupled the valley's population and turned former farmlands into 260 square miles of suburbia. Eager consumers were in abundance. Also in abundance, cars. With the Interstate 405's completion in 1961, more and more consumers were passing by the Van Nuys Brewery, calling attention to the location. The ingredients for another Busch Gardens park were all there, ready to go.
Do you know of any other beer so proud of its ingredients, it prints them plainly on every can and bottle? Next time, make it Bud. Budweiser, king of beers.
Sure.
In 1963, sketches for a new type of brewery tour were commissioned. The next year, an adjacent cabbage patch was purchased. With an initial budget of $3 million, Busch converted 17 acres into a tropical oasis. Design firm Ladd & Kelsey developed an environment for bird habitats, an outdoor stage, waterways, jungle, and supporting infrastructure. Busch Gardens Van Nuys opened in 1966 with 3 hospitality houses. The Budweiser Pavilion, first and foremost, promoted the core brand of the Busch Empire. The Michelob Terrace championed the high-end pale lager first introduced in 1896 as a draft beer for connoisseurs. The Busch Bavarian Pavilion boosted the company's lower price and second most popular line.
Bartender! Bartender, I want service! Coming! What kind of beer, sir? Any kind, you lunkhead, any kind! Ooh, you need a Busch. You're all tensed up. No wonder. My 2 key men quit me yesterday, and I can't get anyone to do the job like they can. Drink your Busch, stranger. It'll do you good. You're right. When you're due for a beer, this Busch does it.
Each hospitality house recalled the German concept of beer as a way of life, which the founder had believed in passionately and infused into the company's early promotions. Circling the pavilions was the Tropical Cruise, a 20-minute glide through the garden's bird habitats. Boats floated past 3,000 tons of feather rock in the gorge, home to the storks. Flamingos coalesced on a spit in the central lagoon. The parrots and macaws gabbed in the Palm Island area. Several dozen bird species roam the park, joined over the years by some non-feathered friends. Every sightline was covered in lush foliage, just like all previous Busch Gardens parks. Off the boats, visitors could find more birds along trails and walkways. over in the not-so-tropical Penguin and Otter House, an Antarctic recreation reminded guests that Budweiser was the first beer ever to be shipped in refrigerated cars. To some, the park was known as Busch Gardens and Bird Sanctuary, likely due to such attractions as the Bird Diet Kitchen. The Australian Cockatoo exhibit and Bird Circus offered the typical animal demonstrations found in a theme park or zoo.
Well, you won't find me complaining. Now when the man shows himself to be a person of such taste and discrimination, just because you have to make a phone call is no reason to leave the Budweiser behind. I wonder if he knows that Budweiser is the only beer in America that is Beechwood aged. Oh, he's coming out. I think I'll ask him.
Hey, Mac, you give me another bottle of Bud. I got some more calls to make. Best reason in the world to drink beer, especially Bud.
Separated from the gardens was the Sky Rail, a suspended monorail that took guests through the brewery on a tour of Busch's brewing process. From Arrow Development's small observation cars, visitors got a bird's eye view of the entire factory, all 3,500 feet of it. The underhung monorail line had 7 two-car trains, each powered by propane. A recorded narration by Ed McMahon explained the entire cycle from the mash to starting, cool fermentation, finishing, and bottling. One other thing visitors might find if their timing was right was the famous Budweiser Clydesdales. Strategically, Busch Gardens Van Nuys was evenly positioned with other popular destinations in the region, including the Universal Studios Tour, Jungleland USA, Marineland of the Pacific, Disneyland, and Knott's Berry Farm. In 1971, the Newhall Land and Farming Company opened an amusement park 17 miles up the interstate, and still Busch Gardens Van Nuys held its own. Gussie's second theme park was popular enough that the company invested in a 5-acre expansion in 1972. The expansion included Yahoo Flume Ride, a rare Arrow double barrel. The compact Van Nuys flume passed by all the other new attractions: Speedboat Landing, Eagle Playhouse, the Free Flight Aviary, International Cafe and Refreshment Stand, and finally, the station for Busch's second Van Nuys monorail line. Not to be confused with the Brewery Tour Skyrail, the junior edition was called Sky Trolley. Very original. Sky Trolley connected to a station near the main entrance so that visitors could drop into the expansion without crossing over the railroad tracks on foot. Yahoo Flume concluded with a leap over Sky Trolley into the park's second tropical lagoon.
Let's move on to the next point of consideration: stock rotation. When beer is not properly rotated, it gets too old. It loses some of its original aroma and flavor. Stock rotation is important in every storage area: in the underbar cooler and the back bar cooler, and on the grocery shelf, in the refrigerators. And stock rotation is equally important in tavern take-home departments and product displays. Just remember the basic rule of stock rotation: use oldest stock first.
With the 1972 expansion, a fourth pavilion was added, the Vista Point Hospitality House. Each pavilion offered free beer. Beer samples. The sample policy changed over time. At one point, the rule stated that visitors of drinking age were allowed 2 samples of beer at each pavilion, up to 10 ounces per serving. That either adds up to 80 ounces of free beer, or I've been overserved. The initial parking charge for visitors to the Los Angeles Brewery was 25 cents. It inched up over the years, probably to offset all the free beer. General admission varied. At its most expensive, Busch Gardens Van Nuys charged adults $5.25 for a day of exploring, riding, and imbibing. Busch Gardens Van Nuys hit peak attendance in 1975, with 1.2 million visitors. Unfortunately, in May of that year, the theme park's champion, Gussie Busch, was ousted as CEO in a boardroom coup led by his son. August 3rd. In 1976, the Van Nuys theme park attendance dropped to under 1 million guests, prompting the company's new ruler to start scaling back. Guests to Busch Gardens Van Nuys in 1977 were offered access to the pavilions, the tropical cruise, which would now cost $1, and the brewery tour. The expansion was defunct. The park's focus on the birds sharpened, advertising 1,500 birds of some 180 different species. Among those were over 200 Amazon parrots seized by the feds from smuggling operations, which Busch offered to foster for a fee. Busch Gardens Van Nuys was rebranded as a sales promotion facility. August 3rd expected the truncated operation to have a positive effect on earnings. Meanwhile, out in the nation's supermarkets and sports bars, a new player was winning over beer drinkers, and its impact on American taste would result in dire consequences for Gussie's Californian paradise.
Welcome everybody to the light beer battle of the big guys. And there they are, two teams locked in mortal combat to decide the eternal argument over light beer. On one side, the big guys who think the best thing about light is it tastes great.
Yeah, it tastes great. Tastes great.
On the other side, the big guys who think the best thing about light is it has a third less calories than their regular beer. It's less filling.
I feel strongly both ways.
I tell you, this is really no respect. Blue is the violet and red is the rose. You don't pull them or break your nose.
The tension here is almost unbearable.
Light beer had been around since the 40s, however they never caught on. That all changed in 1967 when a biochemist in New York State created a recipe for a pale lager with lower calories that didn't sacrifice taste. After a series of brewery acquisitions and consolidations, the recipe wound up with Miller Brewing Company of Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Miller launched the low-calorie beer nationally in 1975, backed by a blitzkrieg of ads, notably featuring prominent athletes of the day. Light was a hit, and in only 2 years lifted Miller into second place in the American beer market. Anheuser-Busch was forced to respond with a light beer of their own, but to do so required an increase in production capacity. They needed space near an existing brewery, and with that, the die was cast. Busch Gardens Van Nuys began dismantling in 1978. The birds found new sanctuaries at the other Busch Gardens park as well as the Los Angeles Zoo. Bits and boulders of the famous grotto were shipped to the Tampa and Williamsburg Gardens. Some local residents grabbed pieces of the pavilions to decorate their homes before wrecking crews tore everything down. August 3rd paved paradise, and by 1982, the former park space was occupied by the first facility to ever produce Bud Light, a label that rose to dominate global beer sales.
Born of tradition, nurtured by pride. Budweiser Light, with a clean, distinctive taste. A light beer worthy of the king of beers.
Remnants of Busch Gardens Van Nuys can be found by careful observers, some easier than others. The original Skyrail track is plainly visible from Roscoe Boulevard. Instead of ferrying visitors, today the rail moves product. Also easy to spot is the footbridge connecting the 72 expansion area. In 1991, the Los Angeles Times published an article about a growing community of feral Amazon parrots in Southern California. Some suspect that the birds are escapees from the old Busch Gardens in Van Nuys. It's possible that up to 1,000 of those birds and their progeny still haunt the area. Yahoo Flume was sold to Storytown in Lake George, New York. The double barrel operates today as Desperado Plunge. Of the original Busch Gardens in Pasadena, much of the stonework remains and is being excavated by homeowners of the subdivisions which succeeded the Pleasure Park. Even some of the storybook buildings have survived. Busch Gardens Van Nuys was only open for 12 years, yet the goodwill it fostered with locals and theme park fans endures. Today, Gussie's plant in Van Nuys produces the beers of 77 different brands using grain that arrived on the same 150-year-old train tracks. Though we may never retreat to the tropical refuge ever again, The wonders of Busch Gardens Van Nuys echo across the valley like the passing trains of the Southern Pacific. And to that I say, this bud's for you. Thank you so much for watching this episode of Expedition Theme Park. If you enjoyed it, make sure you subscribe to join the expedition. Follow us on Twitter and Instagram for updates on upcoming episodes, and a special thank you to our Patreons for supporting the channel. We will see you next time.